If I click on any of the cards, I get redirected to a new route that contains the slug of the blog post. As we haven't implemented this page yet, we get a nice 404 error page. So let's go back to our editor and create this page. Obviously, we won't create one React component or one page for each blog post. It would be cumbersome to do so and not very efficient. Instead, we will use dynamic pages. So create a new folder and call it posts. Move our previous post.js file inside it and rename it index.js. This page will still be accessible using the same route /posts. Make sure to update the import statement inside that file too. Next, for the individual blog post pages, create a new file and naming slug wrap around square brackets.js. The square brackets is the way to specify to Next.js that we want to create a dynamic page. In other words, we are telling Next.js that we want to create a page for each blog post based on its slug. Now, inside that file, create a new React component with the title, content, author, and publishing date time fields passed as props to it. Then, return our layout component as usual to get the same structure as any other pages and create a page meta object to specify the meta tags of this page. Set the type to article, use the post title, the post content for the page description, and the publishing date. Pass this object as a prop to the layout component. Next, add an article and a header tag to render the post title and the author information. For the author, we render an image for its picture and a p tag for its name. Below the author name, also render the publishing date time formatted. The format date is a simple function from the utils files inside the lib folder I've implemented earlier to convert the datetime string to a more human-readable format. You can find the source code of this function by clicking the link in the description below. Next, add a few styles here and there using Tailwind utility classes. Finally, render the blog post content inside a main tag at the bottom. Now, export an async function named getStaticPaths to fetch the corresponding blog post data and pre-render this page at build time on the server. Once again, use our Fauna query manager and the getPostBySlug method and pass the current blog post slug from the params object. We get this object from the getStaticPaths arguments. And don't forget to import the query manager at the top. Then, return the blog post data once retrieved. If we catch an error, we return not found true to redirect the user to the 404 error page. Okay, now we need to specify to Next.js which pages to pre-render from our dynamic route, as it doesn't know anything about our blog post. In other words, Next.js does not know which slugs to use and therefore which routes to pre-render. So we need to tell Next.js for which blog post we want to create a pre-render static page by providing it with the corresponding slugs. To do so, export an async function named getStaticPaths and create a slug variable to store all the slugs. Then open the fauna.js file inside the lib folder. Here, create a new method named getAllSlugs that we will use to query FaunaDB and fetch the blog post slugs. Use the paginate, match, and index function from the query module and pass the allSlugs index to it. Save the file and go back to the slugs.js file. Create a new variable named cursor as we will need it to retrieve all the slugs from our paginate query. Then, inside the while loop, call our new getAllSlugs method by passing our cursor variable to it. This query returns the current page data and the next cursor named after. Push the current slugs into the slugs array and update our cursor variable with the next cursor. Then return an object with the path of all the pages we want to pre-render. For that, loop over the slugs array and return an object with the params property that will be passed to the getStaticPaths function to fetch the blog post by slug. Then set fallback to true, as we don't want to redirect to a 404 error page if the page has not been pre-rendered at build time. Instead, Next.js will render a fallback page and run the getStaticPaths function at request time immediately after. This is useful in our case because we want to let our user create new blog posts on demand, and we don't want to rebuild or redeploy our application every time a user has published a new blog post. Now, let's update our post component. First, import the user router hook from Next router, and call it inside the component to retrieve the Next.js router. Then, inside our JSX, we check if it is a fallback page and we render a loading text in this case. Otherwise, we render our blog post content. Finally, don't forget to export your component. Now, when we request a blog post page, everything is rendered properly. Our page has been pre-rendered at build time on the server with the blog post data, and loads perfectly fine in the browser. And it works for any existing blog post. But if you try to access a blog post that does not exist, you can see we get a fallback page with our loading text as expected, but then we get redirected to the 404 error page by the getStaticPaths as no blog post exists for these slugs in database. Alright, there is actually one more thing we need to do to activate incremental static generation. So let's go back to your editor and inside the getStaticPaths function, add revalidate in the return object and set its value to 1. This parameter tells Next.js to revalidate every second. And let's do the same thing in the index.js file.